In this video, I'll share my undocumented immigrant journey from Mexico to the US and to Canada, covering why I became undocumented, why I didn't qualify for DACA, why I self-deported, why I'm now banned from re-entering the United States, and my current immigration status here in Canada. In 2022, I decided to self-deport from the United States after being undocumented for 19 years. In order for you to understand the circumstances that led me to make this decision, it's important that I take you all the way to the beginning, which is my birth country, Mexico. I was born in central Mexico in a small pueblo. Both of my grandparents on both sides really struggled to make ends meet for their family, which included my parents. So they had to make very difficult decisions in terms of sending their kids to school, sending their kids to work, or being able to provide their bare day to day necessities. And so my father completed what's the equivalent of a high school education, and my mother only was able to complete what was a middle school level education because they were both forced to work and begin to provide more for the family. Once my parents got married, and especially after they had me, it became very clear to them that it would be incredibly hard to break out of this cycle of poverty. So, after much contemplation, they decided that it was in their best interest to try to immigrate to the United States. I can't even imagine how hard it must have been for them to make this big decision to uproot their entire life and everything they've ever known to move to a new country where they had no money, no connections, no clear idea as to what that would be like. Being very aware that they would face many, many hardships trying to settle in the United States, my parents decided to leave me in the care of my grandparents for a year while they tried to sort things out. After a year, they brought me over to the United States to be with them. I don't remember much about this period of my life because I was very young, but I do remember my parents struggling early on in these days. After a few years of living in the US, my parents decided that this wasn't for them and they wanted to return to Mexico, mostly driven by the fact that both of their parents were ill and they didn't want to miss the opportunity to get to say goodbye to them. So they decided to pack us up and return to Mexico. Being in Mexico was a very much a life-changing experience for me. Growing up low income in the United States, I knew we didn't have much, but it wasn't until we lived in Mexico when I saw true poverty that I understood, even comparing low income in the United States and poverty in Mexico, how different those were and why my parents had decided to leave in the first place. And of course, I wasn't the only one who saw this. Very quickly after we arrived, my parents actually saw that this wasn't the future that they wanted. Thankfully, my grandparents recovered and they were fine up to this point. So my parents actually decided that they wanted to return to the United States. And so we made the trip back. It's important to note here that my family is a mixed status family, meaning that my father, my mother, and I were undocumented, and my siblings are all US citizens. So we already had this challenge of being a mixed status family, but we all made it back. I became aware of what it meant to be undocumented, but only to a limited extent. I understood that because I was undocumented, I couldn't come to the US back in the same way that my siblings could, but I didn't understand it to the extent of what it meant after middle school, after high school, what that meant for me in my adult life and all the challenges that would bring. Years later, when I started high school, this is when things really started to come into focus. Because I was only exposed to the realities of my parents and what I saw in the neighborhood I grew up, I thought that after high school, after middle school, I would go to this high school that was in my neighborhood, and that after high school, I would just get a temp job or a service job, just like my parents did, because that's what I saw growing up. I didn't know that there was a possibility beyond that. And so when I started high school, that's when I really started to hear about this concept of a higher education, college, 2 year programs. But again, I wasn't really thinking about that because since my parents hadn't done it, since I didn't have people around me that had done that, it wasn't really something that I was like, okay, maybe I should look into that. Maybe I should explore that because again, that's not something I was exposed to. In 2012, that's when we heard about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And in this period, there was a lot of excitement, mixed emotions of what this meant because on paper, someone like myself, someone who was taken to the US as a child, would benefit by this program. And that's what the intention was behind this, giving undocumented youth protection against deportation, a work permit, and of course, in some states, the ability to get a driver's license. When this program was first introduced, my family was very excited. They thought that, this would benefit me tremendously. When I read the requirements for that program, I knew that I would not qualify. And of course, the reason I didn't qualify for DACA was because of this period where my family moved back to Mexico. One of the requirements of DACA is to have continuously been present since I believe it's like 2007 or something like that. And that's the period that my family went back to Mexico. So I was not eligible for DACA. One day, like any other in high school, I remember being in class, the phone ringing, and my teacher telling me that I was being called to the office. Thinking not much of it, I decided to walk towards the office. And on the way there, I saw that my mom was standing at the main entrance. Now, my mom, because she was so busy, she's not someone who ever came to see me in high school. She didn't come to registration day, she didn't come to parent teacher conferences, she wouldn't come to my sports meets unless she had the free time to do so. So, knowing that she was there, I immediately knew that something was wrong. And as I got closer and I locked eyes with her, I could see that she had been crying. And that's when I knew something was wrong. And when I got to her, in the most broken way, really trying to hold back her tears, she told me that my father had been detained and she didn't know what to do. When you're undocumented, that's something you never want to hear because you know that in the worst possible case scenario, you could end up being deported. And this worst possible case scenario is what ended up happening to my family. 2 weeks after my father had been picked up, he was deported and ended up back in Mexico. And to have someone in my very own home, in my very own family, be deported made it very scary for me. Someone who wasn't benefited from DACA, who didn't have that protection, to know that I was vulnerable. What didn't make the situation any better was that naturally so, the situation really shook my household. It really changed my mom's mindset. It really affected my younger siblings and it affected me. Because if my very own father, someone who I saw every single day, could be picked up and deported within a matter of 2 weeks, why would I be safe? And for a long time, I felt like I couldn't breathe because I had to keep looking over my shoulder. I had to stay away from any mention of ICE or immigration. It was very common at this time to hear that there was immigration raids happening, that there had been spottings of ICE. ICE was in my community. And that was terrifying. Being a young child, knowing that one day I could be here and the next I could be forced to return to some place that I didn't want to be in was terrifying. And this is when I knew that something had to change because I deserved better than to live in fear. And that's when my shift really changed and that I needed something. I needed something to hold on to know that I would make it past the next year or two, that this wasn't it, that was not going to be the rest of my life. And for me, that was education. The idea that education was way out. After my father's deportation, I really knew that things had to change. And that completely changed my mindset in the way that I saw education. And so for the next 2 years, which were the remainder of my time in high school, I really turned it around. Prior to this point, yes, I was a great student and yes, I was involved, but I really took it to another level. I was heavily involved in honors and AP courses. I did my student council, eventually becoming president. I was in my DECA chapter, eventually becoming president, competing in nationals and state. I also was involved in multiple sports. I volunteered in and outside of the school. So people around me knew that I was committed to this to be college bound. Now, people probably thought that I was college bound because that's what people do. That's the agenda we're fed in school. But for me, education was the way that I saw almost like an end to my undocumented status because that's what my mind needed to believe in order to keep going and to really now break apart. Obviously, education doesn't change your undocumented status, but in a way, it was my shield because I knew that while I was in school, I didn't have to face the realities of what it meant to be undocumented in real life. All my efforts really did pay off because I did graduate fourth in my class. And during graduation, I was recognized to receive the class honorarium because people saw me as someone who was worth recognizing from my class. And I was very honored to receive that benefit. Because of the whole undocumented thing, things were very much stacked against me. I was first gen, I was a Latina, I came from a single parent household. I was also not eligible to qualify for FAFSA, so any type of aid that came from a public source. And because I came from a single parent household and low income, a year in one of these universities would be more than what my mother made a year. So I knew that this money, if there was any, had to come from me. And that's why I applied to so many scholarships. I ended up actually being the one person in my class who received the most scholarships. But these were scholarships that each came from different schools. So if you add them all up, that's how they gave that sum. But all in all, I did manage to earn $10,000 in scholarships for my first year at school. Because I was so blissfully unaware of the expensiveness of higher education, I thought I was fine. But very quickly, when I got to college, I realized there were many things that would not even begin to cover. The food hall and dining halls, the meal plan, the health insurance plan that you're required to get once you're in university, your rent, your food, your bills. Those are all things that I don't know in a way I didn't think about. And so I was forced to work full time, well, it's full time. Even though I had a full scholarship that covered my tuition, all these expenses were on me. And so, because of my undocumented status, once again, I really had to do what I could to make this money. So, at one point, I was babysitting at minimum wage in a place that was super far away, but that's all I could find. At a different point, I was working at a restaurant that closed at 3 in the morning, so I didn't get home until 4 a.m. And then I had classes at like 9 in the morning. I was hustling and it was definitely not easy. And I feel like I missed a lot of undergrad because I was so busy working, but I needed to survive. So I did what I did. College was really hard in the sense that the university I went to, University of Wisconsin Madison, is a PWI, predominantly white institution. So already there are so few of us who are minorities, first gen. And can you imagine even the smaller circle when you think of undocumented people? In the time that I was in undergrad, I met less than 10 people who were undocumented who were studying there. And I would say half of them were part time because, of course, they couldn't afford these expensive price tags. I was very blessed in that I had this scholarship, but it was in my sophomore year of high school that they actually took it away because they became very strict with who was benefiting from the scholarship, so they would not allow undocumented people to be recipients. After months of being in limbo, not knowing what's coming for me, I was grandfathered into the program like were other undocumented individuals, but to this day, they don't accept any more undocumented people. When Trump announced his intention to run for presidency, there was very much a shift on campus. Again, because it was a PWI, there were very few minorities. Now, when it happened that he actually won the election and it was announced that he would be the president, it took me right back to a really bad spot because it took me right back to that point where I felt that I couldn't breathe, that I wasn't safe. And it got so bad that for a few weeks, I couldn't even leave my apartment. And this got so bad that I was placed on academic probation. It was the hardest and darkest parts of my undergrad experience. I was very blessed and very happy to have met such amazing people while I was in undergrad that really helped me get through these points. But I also knew that that erroneous idea that I had where, once I go to university and after I graduate, my undocumented status suddenly just disappears. I knew at that point that that was not happening. And that as I approached graduation day, that what was going to happen to me then? What was I going to do with life? What was I going to do? And I couldn't process the idea that yet again I was going to be subject to be undocumented for an indefinite amount of time because an immigration reform probably wasn't coming. DACA would probably not change its requirements. So what was I supposed to do? This is when the idea of immigrating to another country came into play. And at first, I really doubted myself if I had it in me to be an immigrant, to throw my life into the abyss, to take that leap of faith, not knowing what to expect or if it could have gone horribly wrong. But it was so bad for me that not knowing what the future held for me outside of the United States was something I was willing to take and to just throw myself in versus staying in here, knowing what the situation was like in the United States and that there was no change coming for me. And so I applied to different schools in Canada and Norway. I did get accepted to schools in both countries, but after doing some research, I decided that Canada was the better option. And so in January of 2022, I self deported from the United States and I came to Canada on a study permit. Since I've been in Canada, I originally came on a study permit. I then applied to a work permit in order to complete my program. Then I applied to the post graduation work permit, which is the current work permit that I have today, which has given me a temporary residency status to remain in Canada. I don't know if I'll be able to become a Canadian permanent resident. That would be my dream and my hope. But again, I know better than to put my hopes up with immigration related things because time and time again, I've been crushed and I don't want to go through that again. So if I can't stay, I do feel like I have it in me to try to start all over because I've already done it multiple times. Um, I'll be okay. Because of my whole undocumented situation and the times I left the country and came back, is that I now have the ban from re-entering the United States. So I can't go back. I decided to leave because I knew that I deserved better, because I knew that I could not keep living in fear. I could not keep living in the shadows. No one deserves to go through that. And if something like getting deported could happen to someone so close to me, I wasn't safe. And I would never be safe as long as I wasn't documented in the United States. And for me, living with the uncertainty of not knowing if I'll be able to stay here in Canada or not is something that I'm willing to take on versus living in the United States knowing that nothing's coming, nothing's changing. I couldn't keep living like that, which is why I'm here today.